What's this other user? Is Lacan?
That's the is Lacan is the one that's actually doing the recording.
Oh, okay.
Shows up under that YouTube channel.
So you can't edit this later or anything like that?
Well, we could download the video off YouTube and then edit it. Yes. Right now we're live broadcasting though.
That's beautiful.
Yep. This is real, maybe.
Well, I'm going to start since we're recording. And then Seth comes in, then that's good. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the first chapter at all. Truth is out there.
I got about halfway through.
It's cool. Where do we find fantasy? I got it shared here. Where do we find fantasy and the materialization of ideology are the two end points of the chapter. Again, we have the idea of fantasy and trying to make it materialized, and that's kind of Zizek is kind of preoccupied with that kind of idea. He starts to go over some of the things that he normally goes over, as far as some of his examples where he talks about the laboratory and things along those lines. Kind of breaks them into three, and says that those are the fundamental fantasies of those cultures. So like his idea or analogy, or the concept is the English kind of have an economic fantasy. French have politics and German have metaphysics, and he compares that to the laboratory, saying that the Germans have the holes in the front, in the toilet. The French have a hole in the back, and the Anglo-Saxon has some type of synthesis where there's water, and it's a play on who inspects their feces and things along those lines. And so he says you can't get away from ideology or philosophy even when you're in the bathroom. So he likes to say that a lot in his videos and things. It's pretty humorous. He expands a little bit on that in this chapter, though. German reflective thoroughness is something that he attributes to German culture. French revolutionary hastiness and English pragmatism. It's interesting because normally pragmatism is attributed to Americans, but whatever. There is the idea he's preoccupied with this idea of externalizing the belief, and he's visiting that again here with Pascal. So the external ritual here, he's talking about if the subject maintains a minimal distance towards a ritual, then the ideology dominates him or her. And he talks throughout the chapter about having this position of like a cynical attitude, and that when you have that cynical attitude, you're completely enveloped in ideology. When you have the gap between you, when you create a gap between you and the thing that you think is false, but everyone's doing it, so you might as well do it, you're completely enveloped in ideology. And that's what he's talking about there. And he uses Pascal, who's a Christian, as an example, where Pascal is big on following rituals, like Catholic rituals, and saying, oh, if you don't believe, go ahead and do a Catholic ritual. and that can create the belief in you, and then that's the best way to create belief. But having that distance between you and the ritual, that's the thing that will allow you to actually believe. And that's part of fantasy.
Can you zoom in a little bit so it's a little bit bigger on the screen?
Yeah.
Cool. And we'll add these into the Partially Examined Life page and post it on the Google Hangout later, the mind maps.
All right. I think this part is important. Where do we find fantasy? On the margins, and this Zizek, when he's explaining things, he seems to always use some type of comparison between two sides, and sometimes he'll bring out a third side. So that's kind of a Hegelian thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis way. Sometimes he just pits two sides against each other. So whenever he says something like, "Here's the standard notion," you can pretty much assume he's going to later say what he thinks is the real notion. But okay, so the standard notion of fantasy is that which obfuscates antagonisms. I guess he's probably the standard notion within some type of psychological or psychoanalytical circles or something like that. But normally people are thinking fantasies are things that you desire and you can't have them, so it's some kind of wish fulfillment. He talks about that idea later as well. But he's really thinking something else when he's talking about fantasy. He uses some humorous examples here, but in this first chapter, he talks about the purely utilitarian situation on a plane where you have a stewardess doing a kind of almost a comical dance and showing you how to put on the seat belts, and everyone in the plane knows that you're going to die if the plane crashes. But the way that she's displaying it, it's kind of acting like as if the catastrophe that's going to happen is not really something to worry about. And the way that she's doing it, he's saying that that's the gentrification of the catastrophe. So that's a way to pull it into under control, into your own world, symbolize it, and make it so that it's under your control. And then that's the fantasy, and the great fantasy, why everybody loves the one pilot that landed successfully on the water. Everyone, when they get on a plane, they might very well think of that guy, think of him as a hero, even though we know it's basically luck that the guy was able to land. That
Right.
fantasy is a very powerful thing to cover antagonisms. So, did you?
This is right on how to deal with the true horror of the reality of those situation and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The start of it, yeah.
Is there anything else in this chapter that you saw?
You mean that section?
Yeah, this section.
I mean, a lot of them are kind of examples of that same thing. Nope, I think that was it for that part.
All right. All right.
Yes, I guess some of the stuff on the utility, like that stood out. I guess I read over a few times was this externality, which directly embodies the ideology, is also occluded as utility. That was tied in with what you're saying as an example. But that section, and when it rolls in and talking about like someone using the Land Rover to assert the meaning of their what their no nonsense life. The fantasy describing something, that kind of is going the other direction, right? So we have something that we're using that fantasy so to deal with something that the truth is that you're going to die in that plane crash. And then for the other, it's the idea of being down to earth is a bigger thing than being down to earth, like the need to actually show it. So the fantasy becomes more real than the real. I don't know. It kind of made me think of some of the other Zizek stuff.
Right. There's a usefulness, the utility meaning usefulness in fantasy. The usefulness is covering an antagonism or paradox. The Land Rover, like you said, you know damn well you're not going to be riding out in the country. You don't have a down to earth lifestyle. You don't live on a farm. You don't really participate in community. You have some type of distance between everyone around you in your community. This is part of the nuclear family. And then you've got this Land Rover that signals that you have a down to earth lifestyle, and that allows you to act as if you do. At least it signals that you would rather have one, and it allows you to deal with your fundamental paradox that you know that you ought to be closer to those around you. You ought to be part of a community, and you're not. So that's one thing that's all I took out of it.
Right.
The second portion is a bit complicated. When he starts talking about Kant, it's quite interesting, I find. So there's a notion of a fundamental fantasy within Freud, and he talks about Wolfman. Wolfman is the analysand, I guess, the person that he investigated at one point that witnessed his mother being having sex with his father or from behind. So he didn't remember this, and then later he was able to remember it, I guess through some analysis, and Freud was able to say that this has had an effect on your life, and this is what you think sex is about, and sex within Freudian terms has all kinds of implications and things like that. One thing that Zizek says is knowing, there's nothing uplifting about knowing your fundamental fantasy. It's not an uplifting thing. It could be a painful thing. But as he'll see later, traversing the fantasy is something that you need to do in order to get out of an ideology. So this portion is kind of useful. It's one way to approach the idea of fantasy. Every subject has to invent a private formula or fantasy. So there's a Lacanian, I guess you could call it proverb or something, where he says there is no sexual relationship. And that means that everybody has to make up their own idea of what sexual relationships are. And that will be a fantasy. There's this concept that Zizek uses where he called constitution. And it's kind of an advanced concept, but fantasy constitutes our desire. It gives coordination to our desire. So 2 words to remember are desire and well, desire is a big portion to remember, and then there are other things that you, in order to understand this portion here, it's probably just desire is good, but this transcendental schematism that he's talking about is really this thing where, without getting ahead of ourselves, it's something that mediates between kind of a phenomenological, um, external, like the real, and this portion of the things that you experience, you actually experience, and then there's how you make sense out of them. And a schema is a kind of thing that you put in order to give a structure, and that's the Constitution, right? So when he's talking about this, Kant has this whole thing where, and I don't think he does a good job of explaining it here, but he has this whole idea of um, how we approach concepts and how concepts are made, and schemas are part of that. So we got here some of the keywords here. We've got fantasy constitutes our desire, gives coordination. It mediates between the positivity of objects that we encounter and the formal symbolic structure. It provides a schema, so positive objects can be objects of desire. And when we say that there is no sexual relationship, there's a lack, and the filling in of the empty spaces opened up by the formal symbolic structure. So positive objects out there can become objects of desire when there's a lack that we approach or that we experience. So some of that stuff is really, I find it to be kind of not very useful to understand some of the fantasy stuff. I do kind of get when he uses Kant and he uses Hegel to try to get at this, how humans approach concepts and things like that, but I find this to be a bit confusing in this small context. But yeah.
So, where would you find it useful?
The schema stuff?
Yeah.
The Kant stuff is just, I find it to be really, he's his own beast. I find it to be just a little bit too much to try to use. He uses it as an example because he tries to I believe he's trying to reconcile Kant with other things, but I just don't really think he does a good job in this portion of doing it. I don't know where you would use this this portion of Kant, or how you would use it. So I think this idea is expounded on a little bit better later. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Did you see anything in this portion that you wanted to go over?
No, I kind of, it looked interesting, but only in a meta way. I couldn't see how it was directly tying in, so I kind of went on and hadn't gone back to that section. But I'm interested in digging in, I guess, to see what's there and how it would. I assume he's tying it together for some reason, but I just don't see how it connects to the rest of that section.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to save this. All right. So Lacan, being the confusing person that he is, he has different stances on different things in his career, and Zizek tries to explain some of that here. So, with on the left, the shifts in Lacan, early Lacan, the he describes an object as counting only as a stake in the intersubjective struggle for recognition and love. So, for example, the child demands milk to force the mother to display her love. That intersubjective is the relationship between the child and the mother. And then the object, the thing of desire, is the milk in this uh, example. Late Lacan says the object that the subject is something in me more than myself that is worthy of the other's desire. In this situation with the child, it would be, oh, what is it? The child's thinking, what is it that's in me that the mother wants? And how do I manipulate that? And then that's what they say, and that's what he starts saying. This is where desire comes from, and stuff like that. Um, so fantasy in relation to intersubjectivity would be desire is realized and staged. It's always the other's desire. It's an answer to Jevois. You're saying this, but then Jevois means it's a question in French. You're saying this, but what do you really mean by saying it? And that's kind of this unanswerable thing that humans do when they meet up with another human. What do you really want? I hear what you're saying, what you want, but what do you really want? And then how do you deal with that answer is what that whole Chevois is about. Um, and then he starts using this word constitutive again. So establish the subject's constitutive position. This is Zizek again, likes to use the Jewish plot and as an example for a lot of things, because he starts to try to explain why, some of these macro behaviors of whole communities and cultures and things like that. So he says the social fantasy of the Jewish plot is an answer to what does society want from me, right? I am discentered. I'm part of an opaque network whose meaning eludes me. Kind of, he delves into that a little bit more in other portions. But this whole idea of where does the fantasy come from? He's saying that something like a Jewish plot or some things like that come from a question like Shavua, where it's what does society want from me? And when we ask questions like that, we come up with answers that are along the lines of why do I not fulfill what society has asked of me? Or why is society not the way that I think it should be, including me? And then you give an answer, you come up with some answer. And then that's where he says that Jewish plot comes from. Another thing that can complicate things is where it's like a child cannot fathom what object he is to others. And fantasy provides an answer to that dilemma. So the child sees the mom walking around, no idea what it is that they want. They notice sometimes, and we'll get into this with Freud's daughter, that there are things that they can do in order to get what they want. So Freud's daughter, there's an example of her wanting strawberry cake. His idea, or the standard interpretation of Freud, is a hallucinatory satisfaction. You didn't get it, so you fantasized about it, right? So the daughter wanted strawberry cake. She fantasized about it. That's what fantasy is, right? And that's kind of a naive view. What Zizek is saying is a naive view of Freud. But he's saying it's a intersubjective notion is a better way to understand the story of Freud's daughter. When the girl was eating cake, she noticed her parents were satisfied. And then she forms an identity of someone who eats cake and becomes the object of desire of the parents. And so that becoming the object of the desire of the parents, that's what fantasy is all about. That's the constitution of the real world, seeing the mom, which is the other, and seeing that they behave a certain way when you eat the cake. Then you say, I am. Then that's what he'll call interpolation later. I stepped into that slot that was opened, and I am the one who eats cake. You're fulfilling the desire of the other. And that, like a fundamental thing that gets expounded as we grow up and all that stuff.
An answer to the enigma. So that is the answer when we step in.
That's the interpolation, but it's giving an answer. But when we say that it's the answer, his thing is to say that that's an impossible question.
Right. An answer, yes.
So that's like he says right there, symbolic intersubjectivity, the pre-symbolic impossible relation to another. So you really can't be related to the other. The idea of a relation is part of fantasy. Fantasy is how you're related to the other. When we use the word relation and we use this real thing out there, it's kind of the thing that we're calling relation, and this is me adding this on, that is fantasy. That's how we relate, and we constitute this thing in the middle between us and the other is fantasy. Um, so traversing the fantasy is Zizek's way of saying all this stuff is useful. Traversing the fantasy is, um, in this situation, is accepting that there's no secret treasure in me. So there isn't something inside of you that the mother wants. When you eat the strawberry cake and they're happy, you, and when you said, I am the person that eats cake, well, traversing the fantasy, you go back and you do what we just did. We talked about it and we said, really, there isn't something in, I am not the cake eater. That doesn't make sense or whatever. That's a paradox or whatever. That doesn't really exist. That's not something that has a control over me. So I don't need to be eating strawberry cake and getting fat all the time, basically. You know. Um, Late Lacan says the other's desire is a mediator between the barred subject and the lost object that the subject is. The barred subject is its own beast, and he does not talk about it that much in this chapter. But identity is something that if you there's a couple pieces in this chapter that you can kind of get a decent idea of what he says identity is, which is a good thing because everyone throws that word around, but it just really, I think it's one of those ambiguous words that it doesn't really mean anything unless you're using it in a mathematical sense. So, um, I that part of this chapter I find it to be useful. But is there anything else in here that you saw?
I was mainly reading, trying to reread over the, I guess it was the second to last paragraph where it was talking about getting more into the Lacan's earlier interpretation versus the later, and that kind of digs more after he has the cake and the anti-Semitic and all of that. Trying to explain where the subject is and how it's like changed basically based on the, I guess, the identity stuff that you were just talking about. Treasure in me. Right, and then the acceptance of the fact that there is no secret treasure in me, that the support of me, the subject, is purely a fantasy. Anyways, I don't know. I want to, or I'd like to have like this whole part expanded more on the inner subjectivity portion itself. But nothing specific right now. No.
All right. All right. So, all right. In the narrative occlusion of antagonism, occlusion meaning what? Like a filling or a stopping? So like occluding a blood vessel is like stopping it from bleeding kind of thing. So stopping the antagonism. And he uses the word gap a lot. And gap, antagonism, and paradox. And like two concepts have a gap between them that can never be actually logically, and when he uses the term logic, reconciled, and occlusion would be covered, acting like it was reconciled, and then that's fantasy. So she's using this word. Um, so one thing he's saying here, there's a couple things that I'll say at the beginning of this. Whenever Zizek starts talking about Foucault or Derrida, um, it's probably something to pay attention to because they have slightly different or sometimes drastically different ideas of how the world works. And he's going to try to really be careful about how he talks about them, I find, because they're contemporaries with him. So, and they have good followers and stuff, and that's where he tends to be less sloppy. I find, for someone who's long gone, that has many interpretations, like Kant, he's gonna do what he feels like doing. So,
Right.
yeah, anti-narrativist. So he's saying Lacan is one. The analysand, which is the person who's on the couch, right, should not organize their life around another coherent narrative. And that simply he's talking about someone says, oh, you really got to give the person, somebody off the street, you think, okay, there's crazy people, they're psychotic, they can't see the real world the way that it is. A psychologist is supposed to get them to see the world the way that it is. In other words, a narrative. Give them a real story and say, this is how the world really is. Internalize this, you're done. And he's saying, Lacan says, no, that's not what you should do, as an analyst. So he's saying narratives emerge to resolve an antagonism. Narratives presuppose what is already given. For example, a hard worker. Oh, and he's gonna pull in his Marxist examples. The idea of capitalism as from the very beginning, the concept of a hard worker, it's as if he was a full-blown capitalist and knew everything about capitalism and everything like that. But that's a narrative that people who grew up with capitalism believe, right? So if we were to say, hey, um, back when Adam Smith first was talking about some of these things, immediately people were full-blown capitalists. They went from serfs and peasants right into being full-blown capitalists, which that's not the case. But that would be a narrative. So he's just using that as an example. It's an example. This is in and of itself an example of Zizek using a complex example, but he probably should. So this idea here, where he's talking about narratives, rearrange terms into a temporal succession. He's trying to say that's the structure of fantasy. That's one of the structures of fantasy, is it's a temporal succession. And he says whenever you see that, so that when he says the very form witnesses the repressed antagonism, he's saying, oh, that's a little hint that you're coming up into a narrative that is a fantasy. And so he gives another example that I hear later. Oh, on the top right, so we'll get there in a second. So totalitarianism, as an example, the standard notion is the rising of laws that are stained by superego. What does that mean? Zizek says superego is, one way to understand superego is the thing that laughs at you when you fail. It laughs at you when you don't obey the rules, or when you try to obey the rules and you can't. And he says that laws are there, and they are, when he says they're stained by the superego, they are there to kind of like um, they were formed by kind of some type of other entity or extra entity that wants to see you fail, or maybe the laws are kind of draconian and all that stuff. This is the standard notion of totalitarianism. So there's two narratives: the traditional community, the law is rooted in the way of life. So if you can think of the idea of our fantasy of what, let's say, Native Americans were like, okay, they had a way of life that, or you can think of the Rousseau idea of the noble savage. There's this way of life that people had, and that was permeated with jouissance. And then there's modernity that splits the jouissance. So the enjoyment, jouissance is enjoyment, it splits it between the neutral symbolic law and the obscene written rules. So modernity is what came and started creating totalitarianism. And remember, totalitarianism is just basically public and private being the same. There is no difference. So the laws are going to be applied all the way down to your private lives, right? There's no private. And that's kind of the totalitarian, the total. So obscene written rules, unwritten rules emerge in totalitarianism. There's ways that you need to behave that they're not written down anywhere, and then when you don't do them, you get punished, and you don't know why if you're not sophisticated. And that's people's fear is, oh, what we call it is political. We'll say, oh, that area or that company or that way that group over there is doing things, it's political. What does it mean? Oh, there's unwritten rules in there that you got to know in order to win or in order to get to where you want to go. And if you don't like finding out unwritten rules, you better not go over there. And totalitarianism is kind of all that stuff wrapped into one. We really don't like it in America. Basically nobody likes totalitarianism. But that's just one idea of what totalitarianism, how it forms. And he's saying that there's a fantasy on how totalitarianism forms. And he says Foucault has another way. He says traditional laws replaced by discipline. So the law, and then Foucault has a book, Discipline and Punishment, and he talks about, hey, you can be punished, you get the guillotine, and you have the law, you break the law, you get the guillotine. But you know what? That traditional way, now we're going to go ahead and replace it with discipline. So, yeah, you're not going to get the heavy hand, you're going to get prison. And we're going to kind of reform you, we're going to control you in these ways. We're going to try to instill the law into you instead of the law outside of you, and you get punished outside of that. And he's saying this is how the totalitarianism gets formed. And modernity, the subjects can't assume the symbolic mandates, right? They can't perceive the enjoyment of the big other on the law. So, I can't. When you can't see that, and I guess it's starting to get complicated, but you can't see that there is the obscene enjoyment built into the law, then that makes it to where you can't assume the symbolic mandate. That means interpolation. You can't put yourself in the situation that the little girl is, where you're trying to figure out, oh, what is it that you desire? Oh, that, I am that. I'm the cake eater. When you can't do that, then that, he's saying, I believe, I understand this correctly, he's saying that that's how totalitarianism emerges. But now Zizek is saying, nope, they're both mutually exclusive. The law is smeared with enjoyment at the moment that it emerged as a universal law. So whenever you come through and say all men are created equal, or something like that, some type of universal law, inside of it, that just by you uttering it and trying to do it, that's already has the superego built into it, the obscene enjoyment. The obscene enjoyment meaning, oh, I'm going to laugh at you when you fail. So what does that mean? When you say all men are created equal, and then you do something like, okay, you create the Constitution of the United States or whatever, and then you put a little bit of, well, all rational men, literally males, are created equal. So now you got property owners are the only ones, white males, obviously, and non-women, not women.
Right.
And all of that is the part of the law being smeared with this super ego, kind of a laughter that you can never get to the universal, and it's enjoyed by us, I guess, in some way. So that all of that, he's saying that's a way of totalitarianism coming into fruition. So totalitarianism, again, meaning how is it that we don't have a private life? It's all public and private the same, and we internalize the laws, right? So we do it in our private. These trying to make universals and all that stuff like that, that's the beginning. He's saying that's really can be the beginning, I think. So that whole portion is pretty complicated though. Uh, the top, well, let's go to this left hand side where it says the fantasy is the primordial form of the narrative.
Right.
And occults the original deadlock. I think this is wrong. I think it's this. Concludes. I think it's that. I'm not sure. Original deadlock. The this is that example where what I was saying earlier, the primordial accumulation, where primordial accumulation, I guess he's the example of we have this narrative of capitalism where there's two workers, one lazy, one diligent, hardworking, enterprising, and that fantasy is what we use to cover the original violence, which is like feudalism, and how it really came to pass. There was a lot of violence that birthed this, capitalism and stuff like that. But we can't really say, okay, let's accept this violence every time capitalism is instilled. Like whenever we go to another country and we say you guys need to be capitalistic now, we expect them not to be violent and things like that. And so we have this narrative or fantasy and stuff like that. Again, this is the Marxist examples and stuff like that. So then over here, this is an interesting thing where he says the coincidence and emergence and loss. So something coming into existence and the loss of it. So object petite a, we know that that's about the thing that the cause of enjoyment or the cause of desire. Narrativization describes the process where the object is first given and then lost, right? So the true historical break shifts how we measure losses and gains. This whole thing is, well, let's go over here and talk about to the right side. So history versus pre-capitalist versus capitalist. Capitalism, he's saying, is parasitical upon previous traditions, and history gets lost. Pre-capitalism is closed, and history is determined by tradition. Some of this stuff is probably not good. I want to say they're not good examples of what he's trying to display. But coincidence is properly historical in the moment of passage from pre-capitalist and capitalism. Zizek has this whole idea of what he calls events and moments and things like that, and they're part of what we tell ourselves as a story with these narratives and stuff like that. And he's saying, in order to say there's arguments against capitalism being properly historical, and if I didn't write it down here, but if I remember correctly, people are saying, okay, if you have a universal, then that's not historical. It's not something that you need to point to a certain time in history and say that's when it began to exist. Then people will say, oh, capitalism is parasitical upon previous traditions. So it's not historical because it, by definition, eats things historically. It eats the things that it's built on. That's a strange definition, but whatever. Pre-capitalism, so we're talking about feudalism and things like that. They're closed and they're determined by tradition. So those aren't. Well, they're historical, and I find this whole portion here, so I think is a little bit confusing. But this coincidence of emergence and loss has to do with uh, desire and enjoyment and all these things like that. So, um, saying if something's properly historical or not properly historical is something that he's preoccupied with. That's all I really got out of this. Did you get anything else out of this?
Lost on the how much what you were just saying, how much he's digging in. The properly historical stuff kind of started throwing me off even further. But just the whole section on the historical process and the breaks, tying to narration, is pretty confusing. The true historical break, tying that with the loss. I mean, I understand the idea of the first portion with the being misperceived, and then that moment actually that is when it's lost, right? That makes is clear, but as it keeps going, I guess that upper right hand side on the history. But anyways,
the one thing I do know is he's trying to say that there's an antagonism here. There's a paradox in the way that we understand capitalism and pre-capitalism. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the idea why he's bringing it up here as far as the narrative occlusion, so filling in the gap of antagonism. And the saying that there's a coincidence there, and he's saying that coincidence is not, that's an indicator that this is a narrative and a fantasy. It's just very complicated Marxist example.
Right. So I guess what I don't understand when he's talking about, okay, the opposite cliche tells us that capitalism itself is no longer historical. It's rootless with no tradition of its own, and therefore parasitical upon previous traditions, and so on. I mean, how is that not the case for all prior traditions? That we're just saying that that's always the case. Everything is building on prior. How is that? What is historical versus not? If we're saying that capitalism is not and it's rootless, but aren't the other things also?
Yeah, I think his point there is the thing that's universal about capitalism, or the idea that there's a universal about capitalism, is not rooted in history. So he goes on to explain that a bit more. And if you're at that page, if you're right there, what page is that on?
I think mine's different from yours. Mine's on page 16, but it's right before, it's the last paragraph before after the fall.
All right.
The last sentence is, it ends in capitalist universal order.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So this last sentence, Fukuyama's half-forgotten concept. The solution again is the emergence and loss coincide. The properly historical is only a moment, and even if this moment is properly unending and goes on for centuries, the moment of passage from pre-capitalist societies to capitalistic or capitalist universal order. Yeah, and up higher. On the other hand, the opposite cliche tells us that capitalism itself is no longer historical, it is rootless, with no tradition of its own, and therefore parasitical upon previous traditions. A universal order, which, like modern science, can thrive anywhere, from Japan to Argentina, uprooted and slowly corroding all particular life worlds based on specific traditions. So history is that which gets lost with the growth of capitalism, with its ultimate worldwide triumph, signaling the moment of the end of history. So again, it's the universal side. So you saw the key point there where he says science. Right? Science is not historical. He says that in other places. So again, that just means when you say in this context, we could say it means that it's not cultural. It can operate in any culture and at any.
Okay. Okay.
But he's saying that that's what people are saying about capitalism. He's not saying that he says that about capitalism.
Okay. So, I mean, couldn't we say the same thing for any socialism, anything, that it can operate in any culture? Or any environment? If we say it's not tied to a... Capitalism could be utilized somewhere irrespective of whatever the rest of the culture is. I mean, obviously, that is going to change the culture and everything that it says here, but I don't see a difference between that and, you know, any other, anything else like socialism or anything else that you would compare to it.
Right. So if you were to argue that, well, he says that, he gives, if you go further back, he says a supreme example of paradoxical coincidence of emergence and loss is provided with the notion of history itself. Where exactly is its place, that is, which societies can be characterized as properly historical? On the one hand, pre-capitalist societies allegedly do not yet know history proper. They are circular, closed, caught in a repetitive moment, predetermined by tradition. So that word tradition, if you can apply tradition to socialism, he's saying that that's historical. He's saying when you don't have tradition, and he's going to say that later, you're not historical. So he says, so history must emerge afterwards with the decay of closed organic societies. So if socialism or whatever other thing that you want to say is part of a closed organic society, like a closed and it decays and all that, then that's historical. On the other hand, the opposite cliche tells us that capitalism no longer is no longer historical. It's rootless. The thing is that it has no tradition of its own. Then it's parasitical upon previous traditions. So you could say that socialism is parasitical on previous traditions, and then you're trying to say that it's universal, and now you're taking a position that it's ahistorical, that it's not historical.
Okay. So I guess he's just using capitalism as an example, and there could be others that are the same. He said, like modern science, right?
Yeah. But he's using it as an example to say that that is a paradox. It's not. I believe this is what he's saying. It's not historical, right? He says it right at the beginning, right there. The supreme example of paradoxical coincidence of emergence and loss. So something emerging and something being lost at the same time. And he says earlier, and this he does.
History being created, but it doesn't get created until the thing that it's talking about is destroyed and gone.
Right. So this up here is a little bit even more useful. The conclusion to be drawn from this absolute synchronicity, of course, is not that there is no history, since everything was already here from the very outset, but that the historical process does not follow the logic of narration. So that is important. The historical process does not follow the logic of narration. Actual historic breaks are, if anything, more radical than mere narrative deployments, since what changes in them is the entire constellation of emergence and loss. In other words, a true historic break does not simply designate regressive loss or progressive gain of something, but the shift of the very grid which enables us to measure losses and gains. So what is lost and what is gained when you look back at it, and he says this in other places, you're looking back at it from a certain frame. The thing that changes frames, whatever it is that changes the frame of how you measure a loss and a gain, that is a true historical break. A true historical break. And I believe a true historical break is not historical. I think. But in any case, whether it is or not, that's an important thing. And he's saying narration hides that from you. You don't see true historical breaks. You see the nice, pretty picture of something that we said earlier. It's temporal, so it's going in a certain order. And the way that you measure losses and gains within the narration, you apply your current way of measuring losses and gains or whatever to it. Whereas while it's happening, and he says this in other places, while a true historical break is happening, you can't measure it. Because you're using the current ways of measuring losses and gains, and you have no idea that it's happening. You don't know. You want to say history's happening right now, history's happening, but then 100 years from now they look back and you're an idiot. But this is what really was happening. But they're using theirs. But in any case, complicated. He has a whole book called The Event that all he does is talk about this piece. So this one piece. So he finds this an important thing, but I don't find it.
You don't find it?
Not right now, I don't. I mean,
have you read it?
I started it, and then it's kind of the way that he explains it. Don't you find it's a little weird, right? To try to talk about a true historic break, and
right.
You're trying to find, okay, am I supposed to be acting like a detective now? Kind of,
right.
Oh, this is a narration. Okay, I get it. I guess, right? So it's like, okay, I'm already trying to act like a detective for what is fantasy. Now I'm trying to act like a detective for history and what is a true historical break. It's kind of exhausting, but whatever. Let's go one more, and then I think that might be good. So this after the fall, I'll start with saying that Zizek likes. Okay, we already know he likes talking about stuff that's when and Lacan, we're talking about losses and gains, right? And we're talking about the two important words again, sorry, that I meant to say earlier, desire and enjoyment. Desire and enjoyment. Those two things, he's always trying to explain those things in some way. And so after the fall meaning something was lost, and now all kinds of things pop up since something was lost. It could be that now you desire the thing that was lost, you have some type of enjoyment coming from pursuing it, all these things like that. So, all right, the fall, standard notion, fantasizing as indulgence of desires that are prohibited. Indulgence of desires that are prohibited. So, you want the ice cream that makes you fat, right? You're having the fantasizing that's a standard notion. Fantasizing about the ice cream that makes you fat, so it's prohibited, it'll kill you, heart attacks, all that. That's a standard notion. Versus the phantasmic narrative is the act of installment of the law. So that's his position. Now we're going to get into the complicated stuff, right? Phantasmic narrative. So he already talked about how these narratives are kind of weird and how they come into existence. And he's also talked about the law. So anything that's prohibited is law. You got unwritten rules, that falls under unwritten laws. And you got written rules, which falls law. So don't get tricked by, oh, the law that the Supreme Court made or the Constitution, all that. No, we're talking about rules that the symbolic law, just everything, right?
Yeah.
So again, right, I'll just go over again. The three rules, right? The three kinds of rules or the three kinds of laws. There's the kind that you know. There's a kind that you're partially aware. Okay, so there's a kind that you know or are partially aware of, like grammar, right? There's the kind that you don't know at all. You just do them, but you don't know or aware that you're doing them. And there's a kind that you can't be seen to know. So those are the unwritten rules. If you start pointing them out, people are like, "Hey, you're being obscene because you're pointing out the rule that, if you're saying the emperor has no clothes and you're not supposed to do that, stop it." That kind of thing. So you got those three things. You got prohibitions. You got prohibitions on top of prohibitions, all that. The impossible scene of castration. Okay, so now we've got the special word castration. Very complicated. First thing is saying something was lost, right? Something was cut, right? Let's talk about it. So fantasy is very close to perversion. The paradox of perversion is successful. The paradox of the pervert is that he successfully avoids a deadlock. And so how does he do that, right? The fantasy is close to perversion. The perverse ritual, right? The pervert, the object of desire is the law itself. And he wants to be integrated into functioning. He uses an example in other places where he talks about the Nazis in Auschwitz. You could look at them as saying that they had to, the ones that were the lower end foot soldier that was in Auschwitz, that had to execute people, had to put people in ovens and stuff like that. They when they went ahead and enjoyed it anyways, because they thought that the people that they were killing were the cause of their problems, and they were they were part of the Jewish plot and all that stuff. When they enjoyed what they were doing, they were perverts. When they turned back and said, "Well, I had to do it." Yeah, but you enjoyed doing it. Well, but I had to do it, right? When you put yourself in the position that you're part of the rules, you're part of the functioning, that's what a pervert is. Basically, another way, to me, I look at it as that's the hacker. Oh, I found the hole. I want to be, not only did I find the hole, but I want to be part of the implementation of the hole. So you could say the white hat hacker. Hey, you left this open, and it's within my rights to exploit it. I'm going to show you that it's open. By the way, I enjoy showing the world that you have something open in a responsible way. I'll give you a month, but then everyone's going to know about this hole, and I'm going to put my name on it that this was this hole. So I'm going to enjoy it. It's fun. I'm going to tell my friends about it and all that stuff. And there's something about that. This definition of what a pervert is. Pervert isn't breaking the rules. Pervert is internalizing the rules. Very important for his whole thing. So the perverse ritual stages acts of castration, primordial loss, allows the subject to enter into symbolic order. So the perverse ritual is exactly what we were just talking about. They want to be inside of the law. Now, let's go down to the bottom. So, searches for the phantasmic point of the fall. All right. These are examples of searches. So the German fall, we were talking about this the other day with one of our friends. What is it that makes people, right, an otherwise intelligent society, a whole country, behave a certain way, right? Which, so how did Nazism come to pass? And some people talk about the 30 Years' War. Some people talk about the romantic reaction to Kant, the Bismarckian state of socialism or state socialism, the Germanic tribes' resistance to Romans, right? And so you go further and further back, right? And so none of these examples, I guess the more sophisticated people, nobody points to Hitler. Everybody points to further something previous to Hitler. There was a priming, but what was it? And it goes further and further back, trying to figure out where is that one point where it happened. And he points at Foucault having this, what he's calling a problem, trying to search for this point. When did sexuality emerge? I don't know if you know, but Foucault was a homosexual, and he talked about what is sexuality a lot. And he's trying to say where do these structures come from and all this stuff like that. And he goes and he does the same kind of thing, going further and further back, and trying to figure out how it emerged, and he gets caught up in giving these explanations of what Zizek's calling phantasmic entities. So if you go over to this top right, the falls never occurred in the present, and I'm gonna go. Okay, so this part is a little confusing. The example of Paradise Lost, when you're talking about analogies with Adam and Eve from Christian stories, right? One thing that Zizek finds interesting is Adam never decides. He doesn't decide. He just finds that he has already decided. And so that's a paradox. A decision in the present presupposes the freedom to choose. So he's talking about eating the apple from the tree and all this stuff like that. And so we're talking about freedom, right? So the apple's supposed to say, hey, you're going to know right from wrong. And so how is it that you're going to, so that's some type of freedom choice. And then, but you already have a freedom choice to even eat the apple. So it seems kind of odd that you're doing some type of choice to figure out if you're going to choose or you're going to have the freedom to choose. And he's saying, hey, this is a narration because you kind of found out you already decided. That's the story. It's kind of, hey, the woman came up to him and said, hey, I already ate this. Why don't you take a bite? So he's kind of already part of that whole thing. And that he's saying, I believe, is, this is a narration, right? And so Paradise Lost is part of that story, or talking about that story. The choice to retain causes a loss. This is all talking about castration. Castration doesn't actually deprive you of a thing. It actually adds a non-existent thing. So we're talking about object petite A again. This thing that's the object cause of your desire. Existing experiences appear lacking. This kind of thing, when he gets into start talking about this kind of thing, there's this extra entity or extra thing that you just can't put your finger on that you want. And he kind of relates it to being hysterical and stuff like that. My example that I like is, if you like peanut butter and you're trying to scrape the very bottom of the jar, it seems like that very last piece has something. You spend more energy getting that very last piece of the peanut butter or the very last piece of toothpaste out of the tube, and it's like almost as if it has something that the rest of it didn't have. And but it doesn't. It doesn't really. But you spend this little extra, and that's this hysterical thing that comes over you, and it kind of points to this object cause of desire that you can't really get at, and it's never quite perfect when you do think that you got it, and that's this hystericalism. And castration is kind of, you have a loss, it's gone, and then but it's not really a physical loss, a positive loss. There's an extra phantasmic thing that's added on to things that are right in front of you.
Right.
Yeah.
Or what wasn't there, and now you have the fantasy of it, and now, yeah, it makes sense as I'm reading it, and then I go back over and I feel like I didn't get it the first time.
Yeah. It's one of those things where one of the analogies work for you, then it's almost like I don't know how useful it is to look at any of the other analogies. It's like
Yeah,
the
that's
same thing with,
almost like they confuse it.
yes, exactly. Though for me, like the Monty Hall problem, the one analogy is, oh, if you have a million doors and somebody shuts the 900,099 whatever doors, right? And you picked your one door, then someone else goes and shuts all those other doors and leaves one of them. It says, well, you got to keep your door, you got to pick the other one. You're going to be like, oh, I definitely going to pick the one you left. No, you left the one that has the freaking Maserati behind it, for sure. Right?
Right.
So that helps me. The three doors and all the rest of it on Wikipedia does not help me. All of them. They do not. So that's how I feel about a lot of these analogies. Oftentimes, so.
You want someone to show you which one not to pick, then you're good.
Well, no, I mean, that one analogy works for me. And the rest of them, I don't ever want to see them again. They make it worse. Right? It's to me, they make it worse. And this, you can see one that you enjoy and you think, oh, yeah, I got that. And then you see some of these other ones, he's talking about Marxism and all that, and it's like, I wish I could unread that. But, it's whatever. So I think that would be a good place to stop. This Impossible Gaze one it's an easy one, but we're already over an hour. We could set up another one to finish these off.
I think maybe let's set up for next Thursday evening, so we just do the same thing.
Yeah, that works.
So this is about, it looks like we're about halfway-ish.
Yeah.
The Impossible Gaze might be, yeah, if we finish the Impossible Gaze, it would be halfway, I guess. Do you want to do that one, or you want to just cut here?
Okay, let's do it. Impossible Gaze. Gaze by which the subject is already present at the act of his own conception. Let's just read through it. Must act for, when we're dealing with a gaze, you must ask, for which gaze is this fantasy staged? So when you're trying to critique and see if there's a fantasy, you can ask this question from the beginning, and it'll help you to figure out, oh, this is a fantasy because it could never happen, right? So the story here where he talks about aborted children staring at their parents. So there's a story where there's an island where there's aborted children on the island, and they're alive, and they're looking at their parents, and they're this kind of thing, and so obviously things that are dead can't look at their parents. But the story itself is a fantasy that has power, and so that's an example of an impossible gaze. I found this to be interesting though when he starts talking about it a little bit. He's kind of saying that this is some kind of uh, trope that comes up a lot. So the encounter of two lacks, the subject's lack. What would you do if I disappeared? So he's saying that children have this fantasy a lot. What would you do if I did not exist? Right? And if you ask that kind of question and you get some kind of enjoyment from it, it's from an impossible gaze. You would not, if you didn't exist, you couldn't have enjoyment. The other's lack savoir. What is it? What is it that you really want? And he's saying that these two, when they meet each other, that's kind of this trope of a fantasy of an impossible gaze. The gaze of the innocent observer, impossible neutral gaze, someone who falsely exempts himself from the concrete historical existence. So trying to act like he has a big example of this using the Serbia and the Balkans and all that stuff like that, but it's just basically trying to act like as if you're innocent and you're not. You're part of history and you can't have a neutral. It's the idea that you cannot have a neutral gaze when you look at something like the Balkans. And we go over here, Mother Teresa in Calcutta. Yeah, he's saying that the whole fantasy that Mother Teresa builds up in India is saying that, hey, Calcutta is really bad. But he says somewhere else, yeah, Calcutta is displayed as third world, but it's actually more culturally thriving than Bombay. And it has a whole network of social services. He's saying that Calcutta is the one that's more socialist. And but Mother Teresa wants to offer this fantasy so that the people that in Calcutta that are poor, they don't do anything to try to disturb things, right? But politically, and then it also helps people in the West say, okay, our money is how we solve the problem over there. There's no way that they can solve that politically. Right.
So it sounds like it's just saying this is another. This is a way that we intentionally use a fantasy to cloud people's view of reality.
Yeah.
Like the end. So the third world. Talking about with regards to what can we do for it was talking about Mother Teresa and contributions and other stuff. The third world is a hell on earth, as a place so utterly desolate that no political activity, only charity and compassion can alleviate the suffering. And building out the fantasy and I guess creating this impossible gaze it's kind of weird because it's after you talk about like the novel with the anti-abortion fairy tale, right? So now we're trying to create something like that, but that people will buy enough that they see as real, and they're not going to look far enough in to see whether or not it's actually true.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways,
the part that he tries to say though, for it to be a real fantasy, is it has to have that antagonism, and part of it, the further that you look in, the more you can be trapped. It isn't just you get to look more in, and you become untrapped. The fantasy is supposed to be the thing that gets you. You look more in, and you get the hooks sink in deeper. If you're saying traversing the fantasy, so you try to say, let me look at the paradox that is here.
Right.
Then that's supposed to help you. But investigating what we would call the facts, Like, what are the facts? He gives an example. If you were to say, what are the facts about Jewish people? Are they really whatever, all the stuff? Are they really more greedy? Are they really all these things? You just doing that, you're going to get trapped in the fantasy. That's what he says. You doing
Okay.
that trap you. You have to look at, you have to come at it a different way. Like you have to come at, okay, uh, humans are not, I'm just talking off the cuff here. I don't know if he says this is the way that I think about it, but you saying there's conditioning and then there's nature and there's nurture. So before you even investigate, there's nature and nurture. You can't say something along the lines of behaviors are nature, right? And Jewish people act that way from genes or something like that. Those are all nurture. Now, if you were to go in and say, now we're going to investigate, people they really do act like that. What you'll find is just more and more of what convinces you of your own position, which is that fantasy that these people are the reason why the world, our nationalistic system and socialistic system is broken because we have these people that exploit it and hack it, and they're bankers and they want to control the world and break our stuff.
Right.
That the opposite of that is okay, so it's not the Jewish people, it's the poor people, the welfare moms. Oh, they're the reason why the
We can't
yeah
move everything
why
forward, and iPhones are more expensive than they should be, or whatever else.
yeah. So capitalism doesn't work because of the welfare moms. Socialism doesn't work because of the greedy Jewish people, right? That kind of thing. When you're in it, and when you're outside of it, it's like obviously that's stupid. But when you're in it, it can when if you were to make the mistake of actually trying to investigate in that, like investigate the facts, let's go look. You can get that's playing right into the fantasy. You can get beat by it.
Right. So, like you're on the mind map and related directly to the book, you have Calcutta versus Bombay, and that Calcutta is more culturally thriving than Bombay, large network of social services and stuff. So if you just went into Calcutta and started digging into all the facts that you're giving, and even if you go and collect more facts, then you could come up and go, hey, there is all this awful stuff, and it seems to be true, and I even found more awful stuff. Here's some great stuff, but there's lots and lots of awful. If you didn't actually step back and start looking at comparing to lots of other countries, you wouldn't come across and go, oh, look at the difference between Bombay, which we don't say is this hell, right? We say the technology and IP in Bombay is thriving and doing great. So if we're talking about that, then let's compare them. Why aren't we saying that Bombay is a hell on earth, right?
Yeah. Well, I think I would think so. Let's us get into it. Like for me, Cuba. Oh, Cuba must be horrible. I mean, we see is that Cuba is horrible. We know a lot of people left there, all that stuff. Well, let's compare Cuba with some other South American or even Caribbean islands. Oh, Cuba's doing just fine. Cuba's doing better than some of those islands. So, but that's not allowed. That's like completely not allowed. That's not even a discussion on any level in the United States, right? So when you would go and you would investigate Cuba, if you see a documentary on Cuba or anything like that, it's you've got people standing in line for ice cream, right? You've got people doing, that kind of stuff, right? And it's very hard for me to look and investigate the facts about Cuba uh, without all of that stuff. I mean, I'll just turn around and say, hey, if I can't, you're saying that I can't become a doctor if I want to, you're going to tell me that that I have to do something else? Hell no. Whatever. That my brain would just only focus on that stuff. I just, but you take a step back and say, well, where are the poor people at? You know, all that stuff. Right now, I've never done that with Cuba. I probably won't ever do it. Right? I never will look and see, well, the average person that in Cuba, how do they live versus some other island right in that immediate vicinity, like compared to Jamaica. It probably is better. I don't know, but
right. And then similarly, like in Jamaica, where at least right now, another thing would be lots of scams and everything else going on, and it's this horrible place for that. And I'm sure if you start comparing it to all sorts of other areas, you may find something very similar.
Yeah.
I know Jerusalem itself has popped up as a super highly technologically advanced with regard to security, which is not what people were looking at for IT or anything else. And anyways, fantasies and stuff, clouding. It just seems like almost like a very specific advanced use of rhetoric to cloud a large group of people, not see what's actually going on. It feels like rhetoric, and you're going to use it specifically to get a group to move a certain way versus fantasies that are still less organic and more intentional, I guess.
Look at this. Cuba versus Jamaica. GDP, 68 billion. Jamaica, 14 billion. So that's something that I would just be like, hell no.
Right.
It's just not something that I would do. I wouldn't compare that.
Yeah.
Per capita, so there's a lot more people alive in Cuba, I guess, because the per capita is still higher, but it's not that much higher than what you would think. Oh, look at that. So this kind of stuff is not even part of a conversation if you were to talk about Cuba, right? As an American, and that's the kind of thing that we're talking about with ideology, stuff like that. He's probably thought of stuff like that in the book, and he's like, yeah, nobody's even going to pay attention to me if I put that. So,
right. I wonder that.
Just looking at that, another thing is, even though you see the stuff, now it's off my screen, it's going to erase, I'm going to forget it.
Yeah. But then I start thinking, why are you forgetting it? Is it because is this a form of propaganda that actually gets you? Yeah, so then makes sense, and then it seems, again, intentional. This section just seems like intentional use of, like, noticing how we deal with fantasy and all of these ideologies that we create. And here's a specific use at a mass level.
Yeah. Ideology definitely can be created. I want to think of it as equilibriums in game theory. If you say that I'm going to bring this one to pass, you might fail. But if you're open to a bunch of things and you're aware of a bunch of key areas where people are susceptible, then you can create something or kind of harness what's already there. So people generally don't like Jewish people. Oh, yeah, you can harness it. People generally don't like poor people. Oh, yeah, harness it. I think that's more what's going on there. I think if you were to, I mean, if you take a socialistic country, I mean, there's plenty of democratic socialistic countries well, I mean, China. We don't hate China. The average American does not hate China. The average American does think some crazy stuff about Cuba. Like, oh, they're executing people there or whatever. They sent all their criminals here. And but and I wanted to say the Democrat socialistic countries in Europe, you ain't gonna get Americans to hate a country in Europe. But Cuba's a bit different enough to where like those people aren't like us. The same thing with China. I mean, yeah, they're not like us, so we don't like them a little bit more, right? So I don't know.
North Korea, even worse, maybe.
North Korea is that one. If they really aren't like how they are in the documentaries, then
Right.
But the funny thing is, South Korea is pretty awesome. So just haven't been there myself. So it's kind of like it's hard to not be sucked into that ideology at least.
Right.
It's like you guys should be like these guys down here. I have no idea why you have this wall up here. You guys should just give up and be like this. But I don't know. Yeah, so I think we're good. This is almost going to 2 hours.
Yeah. So the next one we'll start with is the inherent transgression. That's on page 24 in my book. Which page is it on for you?
It is.
My edition was published in 2008.
Yeah, 24.
Okay, so page 24, the inherent transgression.
It's a big chapter.
Yeah, I'm going to post that into the Pell group so that if anyone wants to just start from right there, they can.
Yeah.
And then, have you finished the mind maps for those?
I'm doing it now. I mean, it's right.
Okay, cool. So,
I mean, I have all the mind maps written up. I just don't have them digital.
Yeah, that's cool. So we'll get the other ones uploaded, and then maybe we can start getting these uploaded ahead.
Yeah.
There is a couple of people that sent me a message said they might want to join, so it'll probably be Thursday. I'll wait maybe till tomorrow to post and the day.
Yeah. Well, why not just make it Thursday? I mean,
There's a few people that said Thursday evening may not work, so maybe Friday evening or whatever. But I'll just wait for a response, and then we'll post.
All right, that works. All right, then, man. Thanks for coming out.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.